Live from London, this is BBC News. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has resigned after a report found he failed to do enough to stop a prolific child abuser. In his resignation statement, Justin Welby said he took personal and institutional responsibility after the Church of England covered up decades of abuse carried out by John Smythe. We've been getting reaction.
Well, I think my reaction overall is sadness. I think it's great sadness when someone's valued ministry has been terminated. I think it's sad that we've come to this point where we've had to, raise so much pressure for Justin to resign.
More reaction to that breaking story in this hour. Today's other main headlines.
The sound you hear is the ticking clock. We are in the final countdown to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
The UN Secretary-General warns leaders at COP29 they have to act on climate change with time running out. And the UN says Israel has not done enough to meet a 30-day American deadline to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which runs out today. Hello and welcome to BBC News. Let's return to that breaking news that the Archbishop of Canterbury has announced his resignation. He'd come under mounting pressure over a report highlighting how he had failed to deal with a prolific abuser associated with the Church of England. John Smythe abused dozens of children and young men over a number of decades. Senior figures in the Anglican Church said Justin Welby's position was untenable because he'd failed to prevent Smythe from carrying out more crimes after he'd first been told of that abuse. Smythe died in South Africa in 2018 without facing justice. Well, in a statement, Archbishop Welby said, "When I was informed in 2013 and told that police had been notified, I believed wrongly that an appropriate resolution would follow. It is very clear that I must take personal and institutional responsibility for the long and re-traumatising period between 2013 and 2024. I hope this decision makes clear how seriously the Church of England understands the need for change and our profound commitment to creating a safer church." He goes on to say, "As I step down, I do so in sorrow with all the victims and survivors of abuse. I believe that stepping aside is in the best interests of the Church of England, which I dearly love and which I've been honoured to serve." Well, a spokesperson for the Prime Minister said Sir Keir Starmer respects the decision that has been taken by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The spokesperson pointed to Sir Keir's previous comments that reiterated that the allegations are horrific and said the Prime Minister respects the decision that has been taken and his thoughts remain first and foremost with all the victims. Well, in a moment, we'll speak to an advocate for the victims of church-based abuse. First, though, let's hear from Reverend Ian Paul, who'd previously organised a petition calling for Justin Welby to resign.
Well, I think my reaction overall is sadness. I think it's great sadness when someone's valued ministry has been terminated. I think it's sad that we've come to this point where we've had to, raise so much pressure for Justin to resign. And certainly the case is that for those of us who set up this petition, we're not at all intending to be judge and jury. We're not intending to gain a scalp. This must be just the first step towards some significant change, the kind of change that the Making Report is asking for in senior leadership in the church. And this has come about not because anyone's been accusing or judging. It's simply because of Justin's own words. His words to, for instance, the BBC during the Jimmy Savile crisis, when he said very clearly, when an organisation fails so badly in safeguarding and protecting the vulnerable, then those in charge, those responsible, the leaders must take responsibility. Last week with Cathy Newman on her interview on Channel 4 News, he said, "I take full responsibility." And it was very striking that the deputy bishop for safeguarding then said, "I'm grateful for Justin's apology, but is that enough? Are words enough?" And I think it's very clear that words on their own aren't enough, because one of the sadnesses about this whole episode, I mean, apart from the historic, the tragedy of the abuse, one of the things I found really challenging is listening to survivors again, particularly Mark Stibbe, who was on Newsnight last night, and someone who I knew many years ago. We were both New Testament academics at the same time. But Mark having to relive and rehearse his abuse in order to ask Justin to do the right thing. And that was extremely painful. So I feel sad. I wish we hadn't got to this. But I'm glad we've got to this point now, and I hope that it means that we can begin to move forward, because there needs to be culture change in senior leadership. Macon made that very clear, and we couldn't see a way of that happening as long as Justin remained in post.
Well, Jane Ozanne is the founding member of the Archbishop's Council. She resigned from the Synod last year, calling on the Archbishop to resign over a separate issue. She explained to me what that was.
Well, I resigned from the Synod because of my concerns over the treatment of LGBT people under a theology that said unity at all costs, that the bishops had to work together and be silent often and not protect the vulnerable. And it's that unity of all costs we've seen over the last few days. You know, no bishop, apart from the very brave Bishop of Newcastle, speaking out and saying what the rest of the general public, Parliament, and frankly the Church have known, that the Archbishop needed to step down. And what we're seeing, I fear, or have seen over the year, is the abuse of power by those in power and a really uncomfortable and unhealthy attitude to sex, which has caused so many problems in so many areas. And indeed, this horrific abuse that has now come to light finally. You know, this report was available 5 years ago, and we have just sat on it. And that is absolutely unacceptable.
Well, Father Alex Frost is a vicar of St Matthew's Church in Burnley and had called for the Archbishop to go, saying his position was untenable. Prior to today's resignation, I spoke to him afterwards. This was his assessment.
I think it's the right decision. It's a positive move for the Church of England. I just wish it had come sooner. I think it would have been better for the well-being of the Church if he'd gone rather than kind of been pushed. There seemed to be a desire to hang on at all costs, and it's a very sad day, but I think it's a positive day for the Church.
You had said that his position was untenable. Just lay out for people watching why you'd come to that conclusion.
Well, to be honest, I come to you speaking as an urban parish priest in Burnley in the Blackburn Diocese, and I really just want to be a voice for Christians, hard-working Christians in the Church who kind of get tarnished with this awful tag that we're all kind of pedos and you know, child abusers, when actually the reality is that we're hard-working, grafting priests and clergy and Christians who are doing some wonderful work, and this cloud that sits there like a dark cloud every day because of the upper echelon's failure to address safeguarding lands at our door when we're trying to take 2 steps forward. We take 5 steps back because we are tarnished with the same brush of those who are in far greater places than I am.
Well, let's speak live on the programme to Andrew Grayston, an author and advocate for victims of church-based abuse. And thank you for joining us here on BBC News. So we've had the resignation. Your reaction to today's events?
It was inevitable, really. The Archbishop had lost the confidence of the other bishops and of quite a large number of church members and clergy, so it had to happen. My worry about this is that one of the things this demonstrates is that the Church of England is ungovernable. There are 2 churches, effectively. As Father Alex was saying there is a church at local level in towns and villages all across England, which is doing fantastic work, sometimes running the food bank or the youth club or caring for people in need. But then there is this other Church of England, the church of power and privilege at the highest levels. And of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury was in the middle of that. And that Church of England has a culture of cover up and secrecy, and I meet day by day and week by week with survivors, victims and survivors of abuse within the Church of England. And 99 times out of 100, people say to me, the abuse that I have suffered from the Church through its processes, its treatment of me, is as bad as the original abuse that I suffered
Yes.
at the hand of some abuser. And the Archbishop has failed to make a difference in that.
You make an absolutely telling point, because I was listening to one of the victims who, even last week, when he was listening to Justin Welby being interviewed by Channel 4 and said, "I'm not going to resign for this," he was affronted by that. And that is nearly a decade after those at the top knew about the extent of this abuse.
Yeah, it would be a mistake to think this is a historic problem, that it was something that happened in the 1980s, or even that the core problem was what happened when the report went to the Archbishop in 2013 and he failed to deal with it properly. This is an ongoing and systemic problem. I speak to people who suffered their abuse within the church in the last 18 months to 3 years and have found the church to have handled it in a really damaging and re-abusing way. And that perhaps the greatest sadness and failing of Justin Welby is the failure to be able to grip that, to grasp it. But there is no particular sign that any successor will be able to do that differently. It isn't Justin Welby who is the problem so much as the culture at the top of the church, and throwing one archbishop under the bus and appointing another isn't going to change that.
Yes, I was going to come on to exactly that point, because you told our producer that church leaders must repent for their willful blindness. We've had other guests on the programme in the last couple of hours talking about the House of Bishops, those at the very top, being silent after last week's absolutely damning report about the abuse, with the exception of the Bishop of Newcastle. How difficult is it going to be then to change the culture in the church?
It seems to me that the Church of England is ungovernable. There's no doubt that Justin Welby came into post and early on grasped the fact that safeguarding failure, that abuse was a huge issue, and wanted to do something about that. So within his 10-year tenure, the church has spent vast amounts more money, has appointed huge numbers of more people to work in safeguarding, but it hasn't made a difference. And the reason for that is there's still no transparency, there's still no independence, there's still no expertise. So what needs to happen now is what Professor Alexis Jay has recommended to the church, which is that all the functions of safeguarding failure should be taken out of the hands of the church altogether and placed in the hands of an independent body with real expertise and ability to receive allegations of abuse, assess them, deal with them, provide support, demand redress for victims and survivors. And that is what was recommended to the church by the country's leading child safety expert. But the hierarchy of the church remains intensely resistant to implementing those recommendations for independence.
Andrew Grayson, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for speaking to us live on today's programme. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Right, because there is a live page running on that story. It is now 3 hours or so since that news broke of the Archbishop of Canterbury resigning. There is regular updates, reaction there on the live page. Just head to the BBC website. Let's turn away to another really important story today, because the world has been warned it is facing the final countdown to limit global temperature rises. That was the stark assessment of the UN Secretary-General at the COP29 climate change conference in Baku. It is a conference marked in part by those who are not there. Some of the most powerful and polluting economies are absent, so no Joe Biden, no Xi Jinping, no Narendra Modi, Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron. Not there in the traditional family photo. Well, Sir Keir Starmer is at the conference and has pledged to cut the UK's carbon emissions by 81% by 2035 compared to levels from 1990. Let's speak now to Diana Grossteins, who is Professor at the Central European University and Vice Chair of the IPCC, the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. She joins me live now from Baku, and thank you so much for being here on the programme. The Secretary-General described this year as a masterclass in destruction. Would you agree with that basic sentiment?
Well, certainly it's very alarming that greenhouse gas emissions still keep rising, and also recent 2 years have shown major departure of different climate indicators from normal. So even though we are over the so-called El Niño phase, which usually keeps global temperatures a bit warmer than average, we are over that, and still many of the climate indicators are not really returning to the formal normal. So yes, certainly there are many grounds for caution. However, it's also important to note that the world also has made a lot of progress.
Very briefly on this, because you mentioned the temperatures, the key target is not to rise temperatures more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Are we on course now to miss that?
Unfortunately, it's now very likely that we are going to reach this temperature threshold in the early 2030s. So yes, it is. We are on that track. Nevertheless, we could still stop global temperatures either at that level or just barely above that level. And that would certainly make a very big difference in our climate and in extreme weather events. For example, recently we had major damages in Spain, in United States, in Central Europe as a result of the Boris cyclone. And all over the world, we see the increasing frequency and increasing intensity of different extreme weather events that are taking more and more toll both in lives as well as infrastructure.
A final question, and I don't want to draw you into the politics, but you will know because you're there at the conference, a lot of alarm at the election of Donald Trump and his views on climate change, but also potentially is it an opportunity to make quick progress on some of the key things that need to be done, that knowledge that come January, that's what's going to happen in the White House. And what are the key things you want to see agreed at this conference?
Well, this conference is called the Climate Summit of Finance, and certainly financing extremely critical in us being able to tackle climate change, both for adaptation as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For example, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to levels that could stop climate change at 1.5 degrees, financial flows are 6 times lower. But also for adaptation globally, we show that 80 to 300 billion United States dollars would be necessary to by 2030 to cover global adaptation costs. So certainly financing needs are really increasing, and the globe must show ability to increase the willingness to pay.
Diana, we have to leave it there, but we are very grateful for your time live on the programme. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. You're watching BBC News. Let's turn to the Middle East because the United Nations says Israel has not done enough to meet a 30-day deadline to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The demands set by the US included allowing access to more aid, evacuating the sick and critically injured, and limiting civilian casualties. Well, in the last hour, Israel's President, Isaac Herzog, has been meeting with President Biden to discuss the crises both in Gaza and Lebanon. Well, let's talk to our correspondents. Jonathan Beale is in Jerusalem for us and Tom Bateman is in Washington. Tom, I'll start with you because the deadline is almost up. What can we expect from the Americans, given none of the major things laid out in that letter 30 days ago have come to fruition?
Well, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the Americans are going to say they believe that the Israelis have made progress in terms of facilitating more humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, and therefore that they won't be enacting any changes of policy. Because remember, the threat in this letter was basically that if the Israelis don't surge aid in, particularly into the north of Gaza, that the Americans would, in their words, review or carry out an assessment in relation to US laws and policy that could entail the restriction of US military assistance, so cutting off some weapons supply, if you look at the letter of the law of the kind of laws they were quoting. But it is now my sense very strongly that in the next couple of hours or so, the Americans are going to say that at the end of this 30-day deadline today, they believe that the Israelis have basically done enough to make progress, to show commitment to getting more aid into Gaza, and therefore that there won't be any restrictions on weapons supply to the Israelis.
And Tom, how does that fit with the figures in terms of aid deliveries going in, the number of trucks that's coming from UNRWA, because they're pointing to only 6% of what the Americans had said should be allowed in?
Well, it doesn't fit at all. I mean, what the Americans are saying bears no relation to what the evidence is for the amount of aid getting into Gaza. We've heard that from UNRWA, as you've been reporting. We've heard it from the UN's humanitarian agency. There was a report today by 18 aid organisations saying that not only has the situation not got any better, it's actually deteriorated in the north of Gaza. We've had the Americans themselves at the United Nations over the last few weeks saying that they are watching the Israelis to ensure that, quotes, a policy of starvation is not taking place in the north of Gaza. So what we're going to have, I think, from the Americans is a form of words that will, I think, effectively say that they think there is the sort of intent and good faith from the Israelis to try and improve the situation. I think they will probably fudge around the actual evidence that shows very clearly what's happening in the north of Gaza, and therefore they will try to attempt to say that they think the Israelis are on the right track in terms of what they're attempting to do, albeit they're not there yet, and that they'll keep monitoring the situation to ensure that the aid actually gets to people who need it.
Let me bring Jonathan Beale in there in Jerusalem. Jonathan, in terms of what we're seeing on the ground, we have seen more strikes from the Israelis. We've also seen Hezbollah launch more rockets. How does that fit with what Israel's foreign minister was saying about the state of Hezbollah over the last, 36 hours?
Yeah, so Israel's new defense minister was saying that essentially Hezbollah had been defeated, and that's because they had taken out the leadership of the militant group in Lebanon. But as you say, since then, Hezbollah have been firing dozens of rockets into Israel, including today. Some of those rockets killed a few Israeli citizens. Also, the airport to Tel Aviv was closed. So it doesn't feel like it's coming to an end, that military operation. Of course, there are still thousands of Israeli troops over the border. Now, I think the hope is that there can be, in the future, a ceasefire. That might be something that they can give the Biden administration in its dying days. Because let's be honest, when we're talking about the demands that the Biden administration has made on Israel, both on getting aid into Gaza, on expanding its military operations, Israel has paid little heed to that. And I think that at the moment they are looking very much forward, as far as this Israeli government is concerned, to the new administration, President Trump. So I think it is frustrating for the current US administration, President Biden, They will say, as Tom has said, that there has been progress on aid, but it's nowhere near the progress they had promised in terms of getting aid into Gaza. And equally, when it comes to the war with Hezbollah, there is a hope that at some stage there can be a ceasefire, but it doesn't seem to be there at the moment, that's for sure.
Jonathan, on a separate issue, let me read the latest statement from Benjamin Netanyahu, who's sent out another message directly to the Iranian people saying, there is one thing the regime fears more than Israel. It is you, the people of Iran. Do not lose hope. Briefly, what do you read into that?
Well, as you say, a direct message with Israel's Prime Minister appealing to the Iranian people, not the government, saying they're wasting money, the Iranian regime, on firing rockets into Israel, which is costing billions of dollars, money which he says could be spent on the people. And I think, there are two things here. First of all, I think he is warning the Iranian regime against carrying out another attack, a retaliatory attack on Israel. And also, he may be also indicating that there is change coming with the election of Donald Trump and the fact that he's saying Donald Trump and him see eye to eye on Iran.
Jonathan Beale there in Jerusalem. Thank you, and thanks to Tom Bateman in Washington. You're up to date here on Verified Live on BBC News.